Welcome to Everything Financial Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbergen. You are listening to the Legacy Radio Network, and we thank you for listening. Wow, 2011 is behind us, and it's time to get out the crystal ball or the Ouija board and try to figure out where we're going in 2012. And, of course, as people in my industry say, we're going to talk about some forward-looking statements on today's show, and forward-looking statements represent purely my opinion and the opinion of those that I will quote, and certainly there's no guarantee in today's volatile environment that these forward-looking statements will be accurate. So you'll want to keep that in mind as we go through today's show. Before we get going into the content that I prepared for today's show, I'd like to remind you that we are starting a new round of discovery groups for 2012. We'll be down in St. Joseph, Michigan on January the 10th. Holland, Michigan on January the 12th, out at Boulder Creek Golf Club, Thursday, January 19th. That's out in Belmont. And over in Norton Shores at the AMG Business Center, Tuesday, January 24th. So 4 discovery groups here in the West Michigan area. We'll be talking about where things may be going in 2012 and how it may affect you and your finances. We'll also be talking about potentially reducing taxes. We'll talk about protecting your heirs' inheritance from divorce and creditors potentially. If you'd like to attend a discovery group or get more information, go to personallegacyseminars.com. That's personallegacyseminars.com. And go ahead and click on the appropriate link, and you can get more information about any of these discovery groups. Well, predictions for the new year. Where are we going economically speaking? I was reading an article published in the Examiner back on December 21, and the title of the article, Gerald Celente expects bank holiday or economic martial law in 2012 predictions. The Celente is one of the more colorful commentators that I have read, and I read literally dozens of research reports and newsletters each month. And if I were to rank them in order of colorfulness, if that's a word, Celente would certainly be at or near the top of the list. Celente is founder of a group called the Trends Research Institute, and he has been writing since probably about 30 years, probably since sometime in the 80s. And he has been pretty decent with his forecast, which makes this most recent forecast a bit alarming. And I'm going to share a bit with you from the Examiner article. Now, certainly predictions made, when someone makes enough predictions, I should say, that they're bound to get some of them right. As the old saying goes, even a stopped watch is right twice a day. But Celente, for the most part, has been fairly accurate. This from the Examiner article. As we move towards the new year and the end of a very chaotic 2011 in the markets, global economy, and in nations dealing with social unrest, it's time to take a look at the economic predictions for 2012. We will continue with the predictions and forecasts made for 2012 by leading trends researcher Gerald Celente, as given during an interview on December 17th and comprising other forecasts made on several other shows in recent days. Over the past month, Gerald Celente has spoken of the coming events and actions by the government, central banks, and the market in several interviews on numerous programs. On December 29th, as a guest with Lou Rockwell, Celente began his forecast with a bang as he stated the U.S. government would issue a bank holiday or some form of economic martial law within the first quarter of 2012. That's pretty alarming. Celente says, my belief, and this is going to be a top trend of 2012, is that in the new year, they're going to bring down the gavel on the system. They're going to pump it up to soak every last penny out of the suckers to spend money on Christmas junk that they don't need. I told you he was a bit colorful and opinionated. And he continued, and after that, after the Christmas holidays are over, then we're going to get the bank holiday. From Christmas holiday to bank holiday, Celente said. Some form expected in the first quarter of 2012. Now, Celente has made his forecast based on the fact that we don't necessarily know what's on the balance sheets of banks. And we've talked about that in great depth on the Everything Financial radio show. If you go back to almost 3 years, to April of 2009, as memory serves, we had a suspension here of something called mark-to-market accounting rules. Now, what does that mean? Well, it just means that if you are recording an asset on your books and you're a bank, some of the assets you may hold on your balance sheet would be, say, for example, a mortgage. And let's say that I'm a banker and I decide I'm going to loan Mr. Jones $100,000 to buy a home. And I do so even though maybe I didn't do the appropriate research on Mr. Jones. I don't know if Mr. Jones can afford to pay me back long term. I just took a pay stub. I didn't really look at his credit rating. And certainly there were some of the subprime mortgages that were written back in 2006 and 2007, 2005 that fell into that particular category. Well, now I know that Mr. Jones lost his job and he can't possibly pay me back that $100,000 that he borrowed. Well, under mark-to-market accounting rules, I would have to either write off that $100,000 and not include it on my balance sheet as an asset since it's not collectible, or I'd have to mark it down to what I reasonably thought I could get for that mortgage. And keep in mind, this is a hypothetical example. Well, when mark-to-market accounting rules were suspended, the banks were allowed to carry this asset, this mortgage to Mr. Jones in this example, on its books at historical values. So I, as a banker, still am reporting this $100,000 asset on my books, even though I know I can't possibly get $100,000 for it. That's the suspension of mark-to-market accounting rules, and that's one of the things that makes Celente say that during 2012, we're going to see a bank holiday. Now, Celente talks about another trend that I think is pretty interesting. And if you're just joining us, this is the Everything Financial radio show on the Legacy Radio Network, and we're talking about 2012 predictions. And as I said at the beginning of the show, we're talking about certainly in making some forward-looking statements, and there's no guarantee, obviously, that these statements will and these predictions will come to pass. But Celente of the Trends Research Institute identifies another trend. He said one of our trends is the technocrat takeover. A technocrat takeover. Well, what is that? Celente goes on to explain. Over in Greece or over in Italy, they're all bragging they're bringing the technocrats, Celente told KWN during one of his interviews. It's not the technocrats, it's the bankers. The bankers have taken over the temples of the capitals of the world. As the bankers take over, and we're seeing what's going on, Celente added, they're throwing out democratically elected governments. We are forecasting there's going to be a severe decline in 2012, particularly in Europe. Celente pointed out that already Europe has enabled two technocrats to take power in Greece and Italy in the past 2 months. Former Greek central banker Papademos was voted in as prime minister when Papandreou was ousted by a vote of no confidence in Parliament. Shortly after this, Italy forced the resignation of Prime Minister Berlusconi and replaced him with former European Central Bank and Bilderberg banker Mario Monti. Neither of these men, Celente points out, were voted in democratically by the people of either country. And this is how technocratic rulership works. So very, very interesting. You know, in our 2012 Market Outlook, which is now available, and if you'd like to get a copy of that, you can go to investingapproach.com. That's investingapproach.com. We not only talk about where we think the market could potentially head and the economy could potentially head in 2012, we also talk about what our view of the long-term trend might be. And I'll share with you just a little bit from this 2012 Market Outlook report. And again, to get your complimentary copy, you can go to investingapproach.com. Just enter your information. Let us know where to mail it, and we'll be glad to mail you a complimentary copy along with some other complimentary information, including a CD with a recent interview I had with an economist talking about his views for 2012. Certainly can give you some interesting and new perspective on how economic events may affect you and your nest egg. Well, we think 2012 at some point during the year. Now, I certainly wouldn't go as far as Celente did and say in the first quarter we're going to see a bank holiday. I don't necessarily agree with that. However, I think it could be a potentially very difficult environment for stocks as the consequences of excessive debt and unfavorable demographics collide. And we're going to talk about that more in this segment and in the next. Now, if you look at excessive debt and you look at demographics, and I'll talk about this in the next segment, we think that certainly in 2012 or certainly no later than 2013, in our view, that we could see a very difficult environment for stocks. In fact, I think that this could be a very difficult year for stocks, 2012 or 2013, and I think it could be as many as 8 to 12 more years before we get another rip-roaring bull market in stocks for reasons that I'll outline in the next segment. In fact, some of the models that we have show that the Dow, we believe, has a high probability within the next 3 to 5 years to potentially decline in the same magnitude as it did in 2001 and 2008. Now, one of the reasons we think that is significant debt excesses. We've talked about the fact that in my recent book, Economic Consequences, that debt has consequences, and one of those consequences is slow economic growth. And slow economic growth is not necessarily good for business, and certainly when businesses aren't producing profits, that's not necessarily good for stocks. We have a lot of debt in the United States, not only at the federal government level, but also in the private sector. And we'll talk more about that in the next segment as Everything Financial Radio returns. Quick reminder before we go to the break, if you would like to get a copy of the 2012 Market Outlook, go to investingapproach.com. That's investingapproach.com. Stay with us. We'll be back after these words. Welcome back to the Legacy Radio Network. You're listening to Everything Financial Radio. I am your host, Dennis Tubbergen. Thanks for joining me today, and Happy New Year. Wow, it's January of 2012. I don't know where 2011 went, but we're talking about what might happen this year in the economy and the markets, getting out our crystal ball, so to speak, and certainly making some forward-looking statements. And in the interest of full disclosure, keep in mind that forward-looking statements are just that. There is no guarantee that these predictions will actually come to pass. Debt. We're talking about debt because one of the biggest obstacles to economic growth, as we see it, is debt. In our discovery groups, and if you would like to attend a discovery group and see firsthand the information that we're talking about, you can go to personallegacyseminars.com and click on the appropriate link. As I mentioned, we will be in 4 different locations around West Michigan during the month of January. The chart that we show at the Discovery Group was compiled with data from the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Now, if you take a look at the chart, if you were to view it, there are 2 lines on the chart. One chart shows the growth of debt, not only at the federal, local, and state government levels, but also in the private sector. And total debt, as we'll talk about, has really doubled 5 times in the last 4 decades. Income, however, has not. Now, this is really a pretty simple calculation. You don't need a PhD in economics to figure this out. Assume for a minute that your household finances look like this. Assume you have a mortgage, you have a home equity loan, assuming you've been adding credit cards to your wallet or purse as frequently as you could, and shortly after you add these credit cards to your collection of credit cards, you decide you're going to max them out, and then you just continue to add to them. So you're adding debt at a much faster rate than your income is growing. At some point, your income won't be sufficient to meet your debt service needs. Now, many of you may remember that we had Chris Martenson, Ph.D., on the show in 2011. Dr. Martenson authored a book called The Crash Course. And if you'd like to go back and listen to my interview with Dr. Martenson, you can go back to everythingfinancialradio.com, click on the archive section, and go back and find that interview. And I'd encourage you to do that. Dr. Martenson observes that debt in the United States has grown exponentially. He said most other developed countries are in precisely similar straits, to quote Dr. Martinson. And as I just mentioned, debt has doubled 5 times in the last 4 decades. Dr. Martinson notes that during the 70s, debt doubled by the early 80s, it doubled again. By 1990, doubled again. 2000 doubled again. And from 2000 to 2010, debt doubled again. And now we have President Obama, according to an article published just this past month in late December, seeking a third debt ceiling increase since the summer deal. This is from a Fox News article titled "Obama to Seek Third Debt Ceiling Increase in Summer Deal," published December 27. The Obama administration will ask Congress to raise the nation's borrowing limit by $1.2 trillion this week, making the third and final increase from a deal negotiated over the summer. Treasury officials say the increase will boost the nation's borrowing limit to $16.4 trillion. $16.4 trillion. Treasury officials say the increase is necessary because the nation will be within $100 billion of the current limit by Friday. This is last year. In August, Congress and the administration agreed to raise the borrowing limit by $2.1 trillion in 3 steps. The parties also agreed to cut more than $2 trillion from the deficit over the next 10 years. Well, as you know, the Super Committee was charged with trying to get that done. They were unable to get that done, so now the mandatory cuts take place, and we'll see if those mandatory cuts actually do happen and if Congress follows through. Well, Martinson points out this is not a recent phenomenon. This debt phenomenon, this growth of debt, has been occurring really over the last 4 decades. Now, he makes another very important point. He says that everything most people know about how the economy works, they learned during this time frame when credit was doubling every 30 quarters on average. See, like household debt that grows to the point where household income won't allow this household debt to be serviced, going back to the mortgage, the home equity loan, and lots of credit cards you've maxed out, total overall debt in the private sector and public sector may have already reached this point worldwide. In fact, in our view, we think that it has. There's simply too much debt compared to the level of income that exists to service this debt. And that brings us to a rather obvious conclusion, best summarized in the words of economist Herbert Stein, who I've quoted before on the show. Mr. Stein said, if something cannot continue forever, it will stop. That's pretty profound. If something cannot continue forever, it will stop. Well, common sense tells you that unless your income is doubling as debt doubles, that particular trend is going to stop. Now, what if we're wrong? What if debt can double again in the next 5 years? At a certain point, it's got to stop. And that's where a lot of the policymakers, a lot of the politicians, some of the presidential candidates are talking about a coming debt crisis, and it, we believe, is real. Now, one of the problems with the way we report economic data, and I'll talk about it more in the next segment, is that economic growth does not take into account debt accumulation. That means that, in our view, the economic data that's reported on the news may not be as positive as it initially sounds. Let me throw out a particular example for you. Let's say that we see that economic growth was 2% last year. Well, if debt increased 4%, is that really growth, or are we borrowing against future production? I'll give you an example because we think with some statistics I'll cover in the next segment that a lot of the growth we've seen over the last 30 years was really more of a growth illusion. Certainly there was some growth, but when you factor in debt accumulation, the numbers that we really net out as far as economic growth are pretty disturbing. That's why we, in 2012 and moving into 2013, are very, very cautious when it comes to what the equity markets may do. We outline this in our market update, which you can get at investingapproach.com. We'll talk more when Everything Financial Radio returns. Stay with us.